February 14, 1945. A makeshift prisoner compound outside Manila, Philippine Islands. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen watched as the newly captured Japanese soldiers filed into the detention area, their faces gaunt, uniforms torn and stained with mud from the fighting in the hills. They moved with the rigid discipline that characterized Imperial Japanese forces even in defeat, maintaining formation despite exhaustion and hunger. Chen had been assigned to the POW processing unit after taking shrapnel in his left shoulder during the Battle of Luzon, a wound that ended his days as a tank commander but left him capable enough for guard duty and prisoner management. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He carried a clipboard with intake forms, a canteen of water, and a sidearm he hoped he would never need to use. What he did not carry, and could not have anticipated, was that this particular group of prisoners would spark a controversy that would expose deep cultural misunderstandings about food, survival, and what it meant to feed an army. The mockery began during the first meal distribution. Chen and two other guards brought out crates of rations, the standard American field rations that had sustained millions of soldiers across multiple theaters of war. Each box contained cans of meat and beans, crackers, dessert items, cigarettes, matches, and toilet paper. The portions were generous by military standards, designed to provide approximately 3,000 calories per day to men engaged in combat operations. Chen handed the first ration to a Japanese lieutenant who had identified himself as Tanaka Hiroshi of the 105th Infantry Regiment. Tanaka accepted the box with both hands in the formal Japanese manner, then examined its contents with an expression that Chen initially misread as gratitude. Instead, Tanaka spoke rapidly in Japanese to the other prisoners. Several laughed, a harsh sound that seemed inappropriate given their circumstances. Through an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier named Daniel Nakamura who had volunteered for intelligence work despite the internment of his own family, Chen learned what Tanaka had said. The Japanese officer had called the rations disgusting, claiming they resembled food for animals rather than soldiers. He had specifically mocked the canned meat, the thick texture of the beans, and the excessive packaging. Other prisoners joined in the criticism, comparing the American rations unfavorably to the rice and pickled vegetables they had eaten in the Imperial Japanese Army. Chen felt anger rising in his chest. These men had been starving in the jungle, subsisting on whatever they could forage after American forces cut their supply lines. Many showed signs of malnutrition and disease. Yet here they were, offered food that American soldiers ate every day, and they responded with contempt. He wanted to point out the irony, to remind them that they were prisoners who should be grateful for any food at all. But his orders were clear. Prisoners were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, fed adequately, and not subjected to abuse or mockery in return. So Chen said nothing, simply distributed the remaining rations and walked away while the Japanese prisoners continued their disparaging comments. The incident might have ended there, forgotten amid the larger chaos of the Manila campaign and the final grinding months of the Pacific War. But 2 days later, something happened that would transform this minor episode into a story that spread through the prisoner compounds and eventually reached military intelligence analysts trying to understand Japanese military culture. On February 16, Chen was assigned to escort a group of prisoners to a work detail repairing bomb damage to a supply road. The route passed directly through an American armored unit's bivouac area where the 3rd Armored Division had pulled back for rest and refitting after heavy fighting in the northern suburbs. Chen and the prisoners arrived during the tanker's lunch hour. What the Japanese prisoners witnessed that day would fundamentally challenge their assumptions about American military logistics and the relationship between food and combat effectiveness. The tank crews were not eating rations. They were not eating any form of preserved or canned military food. Instead, they were eating hot meals prepared by their unit's field kitchen, meals that would have been impressive in a peacetime garrison and seemed almost miraculous in a combat zone. Chen stopped the work detail to allow the prisoners to rest before beginning their labor. From where they stood, they had a clear view of the armored unit's mess area. The smell reached them first, the unmistakable aroma of grilled meat, fresh bread, and coffee. Then they saw the serving line where tankers queued with metal trays, each man receiving portions that seemed impossible given the circumstances of war. There were thick steaks, actually grilled over open fires by cooks who had somehow acquired fresh beef. There were eggs, scrambled in large pans, sourced from local farms that had survived the fighting. There was bread, baked that morning in portable field ovens. There were potatoes, fried in oil until golden. There was real coffee, strong and hot, served in quantities that would have shocked soldiers in other armies where coffee was carefully rationed. The Japanese prisoners stared in disbelief. Lieutenant Tanaka, who had mocked the rations 2 days earlier, stood completely still, his mouth slightly open. Through Nakamura, he asked Chen if what they were seeing was real or some kind of elaborate deception. Chen confirmed that yes, this was how American armored units typically ate when circumstances permitted. The tankers were not receiving special treatment for propaganda purposes. This was standard operating procedure for units pulled back from the front lines. The logistics system that supported American forces in the Pacific had the capacity to deliver not just ammunition and fuel, but also fresh food in quantities and variety that seemed to defy the realities of jungle warfare. Another prisoner, a sergeant named Watanabe Kenji, asked through the interpreter how this was possible. His unit had been on half rations for 3 months before the American offensive began. For the final 2 weeks before capture, they had eaten nothing but rice mixed with tree bark and whatever insects they could catch. The idea that an army could provide steak and eggs to frontline combat units seemed to violate everything he understood about military logistics and the nature of warfare itself. Chen tried to explain the American logistics system, the vast network of supply ships and trucks and warehouses that kept millions of soldiers fed across the Pacific, but his explanation seemed inadequate to bridge the cultural and material gulf between the two armies' approaches to sustenance. The origin of this vast disparity in military food systems traced back years before the war began, to fundamental differences in how nations understood the relationship between nutrition and combat effectiveness. In the 1930s, while Japan's military focused on instilling spiritual strength and the willingness to endure hardship as essential warrior virtues, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps was conducting extensive research into the caloric and nutritional requirements of soldiers under combat conditions. American military planners understood that modern industrial warfare required well-fed troops. Malnutrition led to disease, reduced physical strength, impaired decision-making, and lowered morale. Therefore, feeding soldiers adequately was not a luxury but a military necessity equivalent to providing ammunition and fuel. The development of American field rations reflected this understanding. The ration that Tanaka had mocked was actually the product of years of research and development. Introduced in 1938 and continuously improved throughout the war, it was designed to be nutritionally complete, providing all necessary vitamins and minerals along with sufficient calories. The can format ensured long shelf life and resistance to tropical climates. The variety of meals, though limited by preservation technology, attempted to prevent menu fatigue. The inclusion of cigarettes and toilet paper recognized that soldier welfare extended beyond mere nutrition to comfort and hygiene. The system was not perfect. Soldiers complained about the monotony and the taste. But it represented a serious attempt to keep fighting men healthy under field conditions. By contrast, the Imperial Japanese Army's approach to feeding troops reflected different priorities and constraints. Japan's island nation status meant limited agricultural resources and dependence on imported food. Military planners assumed that occupied territories would provide food for Japanese troops, a policy that led to widespread requisitioning and contributed to famine in occupied areas. Japanese soldiers were expected to endure hardship as part of their warrior training. The ability to fight effectively while hungry was considered a sign of strong spirit. Rations were minimal, typically rice supplemented with pickled vegetables, dried fish when available, and whatever could be locally sourced. As the war turned against Japan and supply lines were cut by American submarines and aircraft, Japanese units increasingly starved. Soldiers in New Guinea, the Philippines, and other isolated garrisons ate grass, tree bark, and in some documented cases, resorted to cannibalism. The contrast between these systems became visible that day outside Manila when Japanese prisoners who had been mocking American rations witnessed American tankers eating steak. But the full story was more complex than a simple comparison of meals. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The American logistics system that delivered those steaks represented an enormous allocation of resources, shipping space, and organizational effort. Every ton of food shipped to the Pacific was a ton that could have been ammunition, fuel, or medical supplies. The decision to prioritize adequate nutrition reflected American military doctrine and the nation's industrial capacity. The United States could afford to feed its soldiers well because its manufacturing base, agricultural production, and merchant marine fleet were vast enough to supply both military and civilian needs simultaneously. Japan lacked this capacity. Even if Japanese military planners had wanted to feed their soldiers as well as American forces fed theirs, the shipping, storage, and distribution infrastructure did not exist. American submarines were sinking Japanese supply ships faster than they could be replaced. The decision to prioritize military equipment over food reflected desperate strategic circumstances, not merely different cultural attitudes. Yet culture mattered too. The emphasis on spiritual strength over physical comfort, the acceptance of suffering as character building, the belief that willpower could transcend material limitations, all these cultural factors shaped how the Japanese military approached the basic problem of keeping soldiers fed. Back at the POW compound after the work detail, the mood among the Japanese prisoners had shifted noticeably. The mockery of rations ceased. Several prisoners approached Chen through Nakamura to ask detailed questions about American food logistics. How much food did the average American soldier receive? How was it transported to frontline units? What percentage of supply tonnage was devoted to food versus ammunition? Chen did not know all the answers, but he shared what he understood. The logistics corps allocated approximately 1/3 of total supply tonnage to food and related items. Fresh food was delivered to units in rear areas whenever possible. Frontline troops ate preserved rations but rotated to rear areas regularly where hot meals were available. No American unit was expected to fight indefinitely on reduced rations. Lieutenant Tanaka listened to these explanations with visible distress. Through Nakamura, he explained that his regiment had been cut off from resupply for 4 months before the final American offensive. His men had fought on progressively reduced rations until they were eating one small bowl of rice per day supplemented with whatever they could scavenge. Dozens died of starvation-related diseases. When the American attack came, his soldiers were too weak to fight effectively. Many could barely walk, let alone conduct defensive operations. He had believed this was the normal condition of warfare, that all armies faced similar deprivation. The revelation that American forces fought while well-fed challenged his understanding of why Japan was losing the war. Other prisoners shared similar experiences. Sergeant Watanabe described how his unit in the mountains north of Manila had resorted to eating snails and rats during the final weeks. A corporal named Sato Takeshi recounted how his company had found an abandoned warehouse containing American supplies and had been shocked by the quantities of food, the variety, the packaging that seemed designed for preservation and ease of use. They had consumed everything they found within days, but it had given them a glimpse of the material superiority they faced. These conversations marked a turning point in how the prisoners understood their defeat. It was not merely that they had been outfought or that American tactics were superior. They had been out-resourced so fundamentally that the two armies were operating under completely different assumptions about what was logistically possible. Chen found himself thinking about his own experiences as a tank commander before his injury. He had never considered food particularly important to his combat effectiveness. Meals were just something that happened between maintenance checks and tactical briefings. But now, listening to these Japanese soldiers describe fighting while starving, he recognized how the steady supply of adequate food had been an invisible foundation of his unit's combat power. His crew had never questioned whether they would eat. They complained about the menu, joked about the cooks, sometimes ate cold rations when tactical situations prevented hot meals, but they had never faced genuine hunger. That security, the knowledge that food would be available, had freed them to focus entirely on fighting. The Japanese soldiers had fought while preoccupied with survival, their bodies weakened, their minds distracted by hunger. The story of the Japanese prisoners' reaction to American tank rations spread beyond the compound. Chen mentioned it in a letter to his sister in California, and she shared it with friends. Nakamura included it in his intelligence reports as an example of Japanese soldiers' lack of understanding about American logistics capabilities. Other guards told the story to newly arrived units, and it became part of the informal oral history of the Pacific War's final months. The story resonated because it captured something essential about the nature of the conflict, the vast material disparity between the combatants, and how that disparity manifested in the most basic human need for food. But there were deeper layers to the story that took time to emerge. As Chen continued working with the POW compound, he developed a more nuanced understanding of Japanese military culture and why the initial mockery of rations had occurred. Through longer conversations with Tanaka and other English-speaking prisoners, facilitated by Nakamura's translation for those who spoke no English, Chen learned that the criticism of American rations had not been primarily about taste or quality. It had been about the cultural meaning of food and what different types of meals signified about warrior identity. In Japanese military culture, the ability to endure hardship and maintain fighting spirit despite physical discomfort was considered essential to the warrior tradition. Adequate food was associated with softness, with civilian life, with a lack of martial virtue. The Japanese soldiers had initially interpreted American rations as evidence that American soldiers were soft, pampered, unwilling to endure the hardships that true warriors accepted. The generous portions and variety suggested an army more concerned with comfort than with victory. This interpretation was reinforced by Japanese propaganda that portrayed Americans as materialistic and weak, unable to match the spiritual strength of Japanese soldiers willing to die for the emperor. The sight of American tankers eating steak shattered this interpretation, but not in the way Chen initially understood. The prisoners were not simply impressed by the food itself. They were confronted with evidence that American forces could maintain combat effectiveness while well-fed, that physical comfort and warrior capability were not mutually exclusive, that perhaps the material approach to warfare was not a weakness but a different kind of strength. This realization was deeply unsettling because it challenged core assumptions about the relationship between suffering and virtue, between deprivation and strength. Tanaka tried to explain this to Chen one evening as they sat outside the compound headquarters. The lieutenant's English was limited but sufficient for basic communication. He spoke about the training he had received at the military academy in Tokyo, where cadets were deliberately subjected to harsh conditions to build character. They were fed minimal rations, subjected to cold, forced to conduct exhausting exercises, all to develop the mental toughness necessary for combat. The academy instructors taught that American and European soldiers were weak because their nations were wealthy and their people were soft. Victory would come from superior spirit overcoming material inferiority. This teaching had proven catastrophically wrong. Tanaka and his fellow prisoners now understood that spirit alone could not overcome starvation, that willpower could not stop American tanks supported by overwhelming logistics, that the virtue they had cultivated through deprivation was no match for an enemy that maintained combat effectiveness through adequate supply. The recognition was bitter. They had been taught to despise the very capabilities that had defeated them. They had mocked the food that represented their enemy's strength. Now they ate that food as prisoners and tried to reconcile their warrior identity with the reality of comprehensive defeat. Chen listened to these conversations with mixed feelings. Part of him felt satisfaction that Japanese soldiers were recognizing American superiority. Part of him felt uncomfortable with the depth of their disillusionment. These men had believed they were fighting for righteous cause, that their suffering had meaning, that their emperor and nation valued their sacrifice. Now they were confronting the possibility that their leaders had sent them to fight a war that was logistically unwinnable, that their suffering had been unnecessary, that better logistics planning might have prevented their starvation. The food that had seemed like a minor issue, worth mocking in their first days of captivity, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Japan's war effort. The impact of this realization extended beyond individual prisoners. In March 1945, intelligence officers began conducting systematic interviews with Japanese POWs about their experiences with food and logistics. The project was driven by recognition that understanding enemy logistics was crucial for planning the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. What the interviews revealed was disturbing. Across multiple theaters, Japanese units had fought while severely malnourished. In New Guinea, entire regiments had essentially ceased to exist as combat-effective units due to starvation. In the Philippines, similar patterns emerged. On Pacific Islands, isolated garrisons had been deliberately written off by Japanese high command, left to starve rather than supplied. The food situation would only worsen as American forces drew closer to Japan. These findings informed American planning in complex ways. Military planners recognized that invading Japan would face an enemy weakened by malnutrition but potentially more desperate and fanatical as a result. The interviews with prisoners suggested that Japanese soldiers understood their material inferiority but were prepared to fight to the death regardless, not because they believed they could win but because surrender was culturally unacceptable. The food situation also presented potential psychological warfare opportunities. If Japanese civilians and soldiers could be made to understand the scale of American logistics capabilities, particularly regarding food, it might undermine their will to continue fighting. This thinking contributed to propaganda efforts emphasizing American material strength and the hopelessness of Japanese resistance. But the planned invasion never occurred. In August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, and Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The prisoners in Chen's compound learned of the surrender through American radio broadcasts before official notification from Japanese authorities. The reaction was complex. Some prisoners wept openly. Others maintained stoic silence. A few attempted suicide, though guards prevented most such attempts. Tanaka sat quietly for several hours after hearing the news, then approached Chen to ask what would happen to Japanese prisoners now that the war was over. Chen honestly did not know. Procedures for handling thousands of POWs after Japanese surrender had not been clearly communicated to compound staff. He assured Tanaka that prisoners would continue to be fed and treated in accordance with international law, that eventually they would be repatriated to Japan. In the meantime, they would remain in custody. This answer seemed to satisfy Tanaka, who returned to his fellow prisoners to discuss their situation. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the compound shifted from the tension of captivity during wartime to the uncertainty of captivity after defeat. The prisoners still ate American rations, but the mockery from those early days never returned. They ate with the recognition that this food represented not just their captors' generosity but the system that had defeated them. The repatriation process took months to organize. American forces in the Pacific suddenly found themselves responsible for hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners and millions of Japanese civilians in occupied territories. Food became a critical issue. Japan's agricultural production had been devastated by bombing and lack of inputs. The Japanese government could not adequately feed its own population. American forces had to continue supplying rations not just to prisoners but increasingly to Japanese civilians to prevent mass starvation. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. The same logistics system that had supported the American war effort now supported the Japanese population it had defeated. Chen remained with the POW compound through September 1945, when he was finally rotated home for discharge. His last conversation with Tanaka occurred the day before Chen's departure. The Japanese lieutenant thanked him for treating the prisoners with respect and dignity. He acknowledged that his initial mockery of American rations had been foolish, born of ignorance and cultural prejudice. He had learned more from those months in captivity about the nature of modern warfare than from years in the Imperial Japanese Army. The lesson was painful but necessary. Japan had fought a war its logistics could not sustain. Its soldiers had suffered unnecessarily due to leadership failures and cultural values that prioritized spirit over material reality. Chen accepted the thanks awkwardly. He had done nothing special, simply followed orders to treat prisoners humanely and answered their questions honestly when asked. But he recognized that his interaction with these men had changed his own understanding as well. He had begun to see how food was not just sustenance but a symbol of deeper systems, cultural values, and national capabilities. The American ability to feed its soldiers well represented industrial capacity, logistics expertise, and a pragmatic approach to warfare that prioritized material solutions over ideological purity. The Japanese failure to adequately feed its soldiers represented resource constraints, strategic overreach, and cultural values that celebrated suffering even when that suffering undermined combat effectiveness. After returning to civilian life in Seattle, Chen rarely spoke about his experiences in the POW compound. The dramatic stories of combat seemed more worthy of retelling than conversations about food with defeated enemies. But decades later, when historians began seriously examining the logistics dimensions of the Pacific War, Chen was interviewed about his observations. He described the initial mockery of rations, the prisoners' shock at seeing tankers eat steak, the gradual realization among Japanese soldiers that they had been fighting a logistically unwinnable war, and Lieutenant Tanaka's eventual acknowledgement that cultural attitudes about food and suffering had contributed to Japan's defeat. These interviews contributed to historical understanding of how the Pacific War was won. Traditional narratives focused on battles, tactics, and strategic decisions. The logistics dimension received less attention, perhaps because supply lines and ration systems seemed less dramatic than amphibious assaults and carrier battles. But historians examining primary sources began recognizing that American logistics superiority was arguably the most decisive factor in the Pacific theater. Japan could not match American production of ships, aircraft, ammunition, and food. Even when Japanese soldiers fought with tremendous courage and tactical skill, they did so while starving, undersupplied, and increasingly isolated from resupply. American forces advanced while well-fed, well-armed, and supported by a logistics system that seemed limitless from the perspective of their enemies. The story of Japanese prisoners mocking American rations, then being stunned by what tankers ate, became a teaching example in military logistics courses. It illustrated how cultural assumptions about food and warfare could blind military forces to material realities. It demonstrated the importance of adequate nutrition for maintaining combat effectiveness. It showed how logistics capabilities could serve psychological warfare purposes by demonstrating overwhelming material superiority. And it provided insight into how defeated enemies processed their defeat, moving from contempt based on cultural superiority to recognition of comprehensive material inferiority. For the Japanese prisoners who experienced this revelation, the impact lasted lifetimes. Some, like Tanaka, returned to Japan and became involved in rebuilding efforts, applying lessons learned about logistics and material planning to civilian reconstruction. Others struggled with the psychological burden of having fought for a cause that seemed, in retrospect, doomed from the start by material constraints their leaders either did not recognize or chose to ignore. The memory of mocking food that represented their enemy's strength, then eating that food as prisoners while their nation starved, became a personal symbol of the war's larger tragic failures. The American tankers who had been eating steak that February day in 1945 had no idea they were being observed by Japanese prisoners or that their meal would become historically significant. They were simply eating what their logistics system provided, taking advantage of fresh food while available before returning to the front lines where preserved rations would once again become standard. For them, the steak was unremarkable, just another meal in a war that had already lasted too long. They could not have known that Japanese soldiers watching them eat were experiencing a revelation about the nature of the conflict, that this simple meal represented the vast material disparity that determined the war's outcome. The historical memory of this incident exists now primarily in archived interviews, military history texts, and occasional retellings and contexts examining the logistics of World War II. It lacks the dramatic appeal of famous battles or the moral clarity of stories about liberation and defeat of tyranny. But for those who understand warfare as a comprehensive system including production, transportation, supply, and sustainment, the story carries profound significance. It illustrates that wars are won not just on battlefields but in factories, on supply ships, in warehouses, and at mess tables where soldiers eat meals that determine whether they can fight effectively tomorrow. The legacy of this encounter between Japanese prisoners and American food systems extends into how modern militaries understand logistics. Contemporary military doctrine recognizes that feeding troops adequately is a force multiplier essential to maintaining combat power. Malnutrition degrades every aspect of military effectiveness. Therefore, logistics planning for food must receive the same serious attention as planning for ammunition and fuel. This understanding, now taken for granted in professional militaries, was hard-won through experiences like those of Japanese soldiers fighting while starving and American soldiers fighting while well-fed, and the dramatic difference in combat effectiveness that resulted from these contrasting approaches. The human dimension of this story remains its most compelling aspect. Lieutenant Tanaka and the other prisoners were not simply military statistics or examples of defeated enemies. They were men who had believed in their cause, endured tremendous suffering in service to that cause, and then faced the painful recognition that their suffering had been unnecessary, that better logistics could have prevented their starvation, that their cultural values about endurance and deprivation had made them vulnerable to an enemy that took a different approach. The psychological burden of this recognition stayed with them for life. They had been taught that suffering built character and that material comfort was weakness. Then they learned that their enemy's material comfort was actually strength, and their suffering had been weakness disguised as virtue. For Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, the encounter with these prisoners provided perspective he carried into civilian life. He had fought in a war where adequate food was taken for granted, where the logistics system functioned so reliably that meals seemed automatic. Meeting men who had fought while starving gave him appreciation for the invisible systems that had supported his service. It also gave him insight into how cultural values shaped military effectiveness, how assumptions about food and suffering could blind nations to material realities, and how comprehensive defeat forced difficult reckonings with failed assumptions. These lessons stayed with him across decades, shaping how he understood not just that war but the nature of conflict and national power more broadly. The interviews intensified through March as intelligence officers systematically questioned prisoners about supply conditions across every theater. What emerged painted a devastating picture of Imperial Japan's logistics collapse. Entire divisions on New Guinea had dissolved not from combat but starvation. Regiments in the Philippines fought on quarter rations for months. Island garrisons were deliberately abandoned to die without resupply. Each testimony confirmed what Chen had witnessed in miniature that day outside Manila. Japan's military had sent hundreds of thousands to fight a war its logistics could never sustain. Lieutenant Tanaka provided the most detailed accounts. His regiment had received its last full supply delivery in October 1944. By November they were eating tree bark soup. December brought rat hunting parties. January saw men too weak to patrol. When Americans attacked in February, his soldiers could barely lift their rifles. He had attributed this to the fortunes of war, assuming all armies faced similar deprivation. Learning that American forces fought while eating steak, eggs, and fresh bread destroyed that assumption completely. His men had not lost to superior tactics or courage. They had lost to an enemy that understood modern war required fed soldiers. The psychological impact rippled through the compound. Prisoners who had maintained rigid military bearing began asking questions that bordered on sedition. How had their commanders allowed such conditions? Why had no one challenged the doctrine that equated suffering with strength? Had their leaders known the war was logistically unwinnable from the start? These questions had no good answers. Tanaka and the other officers struggled to reconcile their warrior training with the evidence of systematic failure. The food they had mocked became a daily reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Chen rotated home in September 1945, carrying memories he rarely shared. Combat stories seemed more appropriate for retelling than conversations about rations with defeated enemies. But decades later, historians found him. His observations about the prisoners' mockery, their shock, and their gradual comprehension contributed to understanding how logistics shaped the Pacific War's outcome. Traditional narratives emphasized battles and strategies. The supply dimension received less attention despite being arguably most decisive. Japan could not match American production of ships, planes, ammunition, or food. Even tremendous courage could not overcome fighting while starving against an enemy fighting while well-fed. The tankers who had eaten steak that February day never knew Japanese prisoners were watching. For them it was just another meal, unremarkable before returning to combat. They could not have known those prisoners were experiencing a revelation about material disparity that determined the war's outcome. The incident exists now in archived interviews and military logistics courses as a teaching example. It illustrates how cultural assumptions about food and warfare can blind forces to material realities, how adequate nutrition multiplies combat effectiveness, and how comprehensive defeat forces painful reckonings with failed assumptions. For Tanaka and the other prisoners, the memory endured across lifetimes. They had mocked food representing their enemy's strength, then eaten that food as prisoners while their nation starved. Some returned to Japan and applied logistics lessons to civilian reconstruction. Others carried the psychological burden of having fought for a cause doomed by material constraints their leaders ignored. The revelation that suffering was not strength but weakness disguised as virtue challenged everything they had believed about warfare and honor. The legacy persists in modern military doctrine recognizing adequate nutrition as essential force multiplication. Malnutrition degrades every aspect of combat effectiveness. This understanding, now standard in professional militaries, was hard-won through experiences of Japanese soldiers fighting while starving and American soldiers fighting while fed. The dramatic difference in effectiveness proved that wars are won not just on battlefields but in factories, supply ships, warehouses, and mess tables where soldiers eat meals determining whether they can fight tomorrow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.